Bueno, pues vamos a intentar hacer el tema 56, las relaciones entre Irlanda y Reino Unido, o Gran Bretaña, y los autores Ocasio y Joyce. Voy a saltarme la introducción y de momento voy a intentar hacer solo la parte que sería el punto número 2, Historical Relations between Ireland and Britain. Tengo aquí estos apuntes y de aquí tengo que intentar sacar todo de este esquema y reconstruirlo. 2.1 from the Christianization period to the 19th century. So Ireland, the first records we have of Ireland is when Christianization arrived to the island with St. Patrick and his followers in the year 432, and there's a myth that when St. Patrick arrived there, he got rid of all the snakes. It even gets to the point that little islands that are between what is now the UK and Ireland, to decide if they are Irish or British, they check if there are snakes, and if there aren't, it belongs to Ireland. In the 12th century, Henry II tried to conquer Ireland, and from that point on there was constant Norman and English interference in the island. In the 16th century is when more things happened. There was a period of what it was called the English Restoration, in which the English monarchy tried to become more prominent and have more importance within Europe, and they tried to centralize their power, and that's why the relationship with Ireland became more tense at the time. There were a lot of settlers from England and Scotland, and they were called planters. These settlers moved to Ireland and they were given land from the Irish nobility, the ones who owned the land, and that also led to a lot of tensions. Religion in all this period, remember that we're talking from the Christianization to the 19th century, was always a source of division and conflicts. There were many restrictions for the Catholic population in Ireland, they couldn't be part of the army just for being Catholics. They couldn't hold any public office, so we're talking about clerks and a lot of other jobs that they didn't have access to. They also had limitations on marriage. They couldn't marry between Protestants and Catholics. We're talking about many centuries of living together and they were not able to marry. And they also had limitations in the political aspect, because they couldn't take part in politics and they couldn't even vote, not just be candidates for anything, they couldn't even vote. They had very limited access to education, and also they had problems with inheritance. If you were Catholic, most likely you were not going to be able to give your what you owned to your children. Okay, let's move on to the next point, 2.2, the Act of Union. This happened in the year 1801. This year is when the creation of the UK happened, United Kingdom. The main reason for that to happen was to limit the influence of the French Revolution. At that time, that spread throughout Europe, and other countries wanted the same new things that the revolutionaries in France were asking for. It meant taking power from the rich and from the powerful people at the time, and more power to the people. In Ireland, in that particular context, as they were kind of part of Britain, what it meant is that they had to be much stricter, and that's why the United Kingdom was created, the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland. There's a famous poem by Seamus Heaney, who was an Irish author who got the Nobel Prize for Literature, that talks about how Irish people felt at the time and how angry they were and how bad the situation was. Then in 1829 is when the Catholic emancipation laws happened. These laws gave a lot more freedom to Irish Catholics within Ireland, just to be able to vote and to have more rights. This was achieved through guerrillas and like a lot of deaths and military action. And the main leader for this cause was Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell is very famous in Ireland because the monument to him that represents him is in the very center of Dublin and is next to the spire, the big long thing that is there, and then we can see Daniel O'Connell. Let's move on to the next part, which is 2.3, the Irish War of Independence, that happened between 1919 and 1921, and the following Irish Civil War that happened between 1922 to 1923. So the starting point for all of this was the Easter Rising of 1916, in which the Irish people rose, and it was a very violent movement. And then the War of Independence really started in the year 1919. It was a war of guerrillas with the IRA being really important in this time. They were fighting in a very clever way because they were outnumbered by the British, but they managed to kill a lot of British soldiers and they were very intelligent about it. At the same time, they also got a lot of international support. When this appeared in the media all throughout Europe, most countries were they were considering that Ireland had the right to protest and to ask for independence. The two main people that participated then in the signing of the treaty were Churchill and Michael Collins. As I've mentioned before, Daniel O'Connell, he is very famous in Ireland. Michael Collins as well. There are several monuments in Dublin dedicated to him. And also it's very interesting, if you ever go to Dublin, to go to the prison where you can see a lot of information about, in particular, O'Connell's and Collins. The Anglo-Irish Treaty had three main points. The first one was the creation of an Irish Free State. The second one was an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. And the third one was the partition of Northern Ireland to become a different country. This treaty, even though it was signed, a lot of people were not happy with it. And that's why two factions were created at the time. One that was pro-treaty and the other one that was against. That civil war happened and the people that were pro-treaty were the ones that won the war. It took about a year. It wasn't that long, especially considering that the War of Independence just happened a couple of years before. And those two parties are still prominent in the Irish political system today. The one that was pro-treaty and the one that was against. Now let's move on to talk about the Republic of Ireland since the split. This would be the point 2.4. The Republic of Ireland, after the split, was struggling economically. The repercussions of the war were bad, and in general it was a poor country. There were problems as well with agriculture, and Ireland has always been a big center of immigration, not only to America but also to Australia and to many other countries. In the year 1973, the Republic of Ireland joined the European Economic Community, EEC, that then became the European Union later. This was very beneficial for Ireland, as the European Economic Community gave them a lot of financial support. With this support, they did very clever investments that improved the infrastructure of the island, as well as the educational system and social services. And with all this, the country improved a lot in many ways. We're talking that a few decades ago, it was mostly an agricultural country. Most people were dedicated to agriculture. And then it became a modern, prosperous country. It has one of the highest GDP figures in the European Union, and the unemployment is very, very low. Ireland is also a leader of pharmaceutical industries and also technology. And there are several international companies that have their headquarters in Dublin or in Ireland. And we're not just talking about the European headquarters, even their main ones. This led to a situation that was called the Celtic Tiger at the end of the 20th century and even now the beginning of the 21st. And this was like a poetic figure to explain how successful Ireland is in the economic terms. Two main things that I would like to highlight are in 2015, same-sex unions and marriage was legalized in Ireland, and in 2018 in the constitution there was a new article banning abortion. Even though Ireland has always been assimilated, or like when we think of Ireland we think of the Catholic religion, it is becoming a very modern country in the recent years, and it also attracts a lot of immigration from other countries in the European Union. Let's go with the last subsection about this historical relation between Britain and Ireland. This part is 2.5, Northern Ireland since the split. We have to talk very importantly here about the Troubles. The Troubles were mainly from the 1960s until the 1990s. And it was a very difficult and critical political situation in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, based on basically the reunification of Ulster to the Republic of Ireland. There were many people that wanted that reunification, and they felt that the heart was Irish, even though in their passport it said that they were from the United Kingdom. And this was a very difficult conflict. Also, knowing that the population was divided because of religion, a lot of the population was Catholic, and the other, I don't know if half, but like a big part of the population was Protestant. There were very big differences between these two sides, considering that the Protestants had better economical resources, better education, and in general they were thriving more than the Catholic counterpart. One event that was very, very significant was in 1972, what it was called later the Bloody Sunday. This happened in the town of Derry, that is called officially Londonderry. And in this day, 14 civilians were killed. They were unarmed, and they were killed by the British soldiers when they were protesting. And this has been told several times in popular culture. One of the main things that we can mention here is the song Zombie by the Cranberries, and U2 also made a song called Sunday Bloody Sunday. The IRA showed retaliation after this attack, and they became a lot more violent than they were before. There were a lot of bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations of British political figure in particular. Well, let's start talking about the author Sean O'Casey. We're going to start talking about his life. Sean O'Casey came from a working class family. We can actually say that at the time it was poverty. He lived in the slums of Dublin, and that had a massive impact and influenced his writing in the future. He was completely self-taught. He learned how to read and write himself, and then he became an avid reader and he was in particular interested in Irish history and politics. When he was younger, he became involved in the labor movement. He was very left-wing, and then he was also involved in Irish nationalism movements and even movements that wanted the independence of Ireland. Although as he was getting older, he progressively moved away from those movements. When he was older, he moved with his family to England, and he kept writing and publishing until his passing, until his death. Let's talk about James Joyce and his life. He came from a middle-class family, although they had 10 siblings, and his family had a lack of stability. His parents had to move a lot because of the job of his father, and that probably had an influence in his future. James Joyce also moved a lot when he was older. He was, from a very young age, an exceptional student. He could speak several languages, and he was very good at literature, and he ended up going to Trinity College for university. He suffered all his life from poor health, in particular his vision. He had to go through different eye surgeries and go to different specialist doctors that sometimes people claim now that made it worse. And we also know from the letters to his brother that he had problems with his arm. Some people looking at that now and knowing what we know have a theory that he suffered from syphilis, although this is not confirmed and other scholars are against this theory. He lived with his partner, Nora, and for a long time they were not married and still living together, and that was very controversial at the time. And they had 2 children. They moved a lot. He was an English teacher abroad. A lot of years they spent them in Zurich, and then they moved to Trieste, and they were also in Paris. He suffered from financial difficulties, and the way he did things was his friends were supporting him a lot, but also some patrons that were giving him money so that he could continue working as a writer. He included a lot of the Irish experience in his writings, and that is because he was a passionate of politics and culture in Ireland. Let's move on to his style. We have divided this section in 3 subsections. The first one would be time and space. In his books, a lot happens in probably just a few seconds, and this was a very revolutionary way of doing narration at the time, because no other author have done that. At the beginning, he was experimenting with time, and we can see that in his works, but it's in his last works when we can see this really happening, like for example in Ulysses. If we talk about space, all his works are based in Dublin, even though we know that he didn't live there for a while, and we can see a difference in the space between what the characters can see and what they explain about the reality, but also their internal world and how different that is from the actual world. We have to talk about the concept of epiphanies in James Joyce's work. These are sudden realizations that characters have about life, about certain things. Umberto Eco, that is a writer but also is a scholar that studied James Joyce, talks a lot about these epiphanies, and we can also link them with Miguel de Unamuno, because both authors that were contemporary had this like a similar relationship with religion and their work, because these epiphanies come like it's a religious concept. These epiphanies a lot of times were about self-awareness of the characters, and we can see that in the passage of Araby including Dubliners. The third point I want to talk about is the stream of consciousness. The first author to use it, first famous author, was Marcel Proust in French, but James Joyce was one of the first to do it in English, because he was reading in different languages, and he was aware of that. In English we can also see Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. A particular passage where we can see this is in Ulysses, in the passage called Proteus, in which Daedalus, the character that is based on himself, on James Joyce, is walking along the shore and having all this very long stream of consciousness passes. And in particular in his last book, Finnegan's Wake, there's also a lot of stream of consciousness. Let's talk about his major works. The first one is Dubliners. Dubliners is a collection of 15 short stories that are based around the city of Dublin, and they are based on different residents of the city, and all of them are very different. They have different personalities, ages, they come from different social classes, and the main thing about this book is the feature that we mentioned before, the epiphanies, because we can see all these characters having these sudden realizations, these epiphanies. Ulysses is his most famous book. It has three main characters, Leopold and Molly Bloom, who are a couple, they're married. Leopold is based on Odysseus, and he's like a modern Odysseus. And Daedalus could be his mouthpiece, because it's based on James Joyce. The book is set in only 24 hours in Dublin, and more important than the story it tells or the development of actions is the development of characters, the personal journey that all of them have in the book and how they get to know themselves. The legacy of James Joyce, this is the last point, is very important. He was one of the main writers of modernism, and he also was playing a lot with the boundaries of narration, and a lot of the advances in this we owe it to him. His books were censored, in particular Ulysses, because it contained explicit content, but now we can see we see that as something else. It's not a problem really. And we can also talk about his legacy in films. There were several films as adaptation from his books, but in particular I want to mention in pop culture how there was an episode of The Simpsons that was based around James Joyce, so that tells us how important he was. Bueno, espero que os haya gustado este vídeo. He intentado de un esquema intentar pasar a la parte final, que sería el examen, y estas 2 horas que tenemos. Bueno, el vídeo dura unos 20 y algo minutos, pero es verdad que me he saltado la introducción y otras partes. Al final esto es lo que más tenemos que practicar, porque tenemos que intentar llegar de un esquemita o de lo que podemos aprendernos a la parte final. Espero que os ayude y voy a intentar hacer esto de más temas. Así que ya sabéis, suscribiros al canal si os gusta y podéis tener comentarios, intentar también en Spotify y en todos los medios en los que estoy. Saludos.